He was the voice of a generation. But in his final hours, Kurt Cobain had something to say that no one ever heard. A letter, unfinished, unsent, and filled with a truth too painful to speak out loud. April 5, 1994, Seattle. Rain falls softly against the windows of a house tucked away from the world. Inside, silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, final. In a small room above the garage, a pen rests on a piece of paper. The handwriting is shaky, the words are raw, and the letter, incomplete. For years, people asked the same question. Why? Why did Kurt Cobain, at the height of his fame, choose to end his life? The world searched for answers in his music, in his interviews, in the pain he carried so openly. But no one knew about the letter, the one he started writing in those last lonely hours, the one that revealed everything he couldn't say out loud. This is the story of that letter, and the truth behind the man who never wanted to be a legend. Kurt Donald Cobain was born on February 20th, 1967, in Aberdeen, Washington, a small, gray logging town where the rain never seemed to stop. His childhood started quietly. A shy boy with blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. He loved to draw. He loved to sing. His mother said he had a gift. His father said he was sensitive, too sensitive for a world that didn't care about feelings. But when Kurt was 8 years old, everything changed. His parents divorced, and that moment shattered something inside him. He became angry, withdrawn. He moved between relatives, never feeling like he truly belonged anywhere. At school, he was bullied. At home, he felt invisible. The only place he felt safe was in his room, with his records and his dreams. Music became his escape. He discovered the Beatles, then punk rock. The raw energy of bands like the Sex Pistols and Black Flag spoke to him in ways nothing else could. For the first time, he felt understood. He picked up a guitar and he started writing songs about pain, about rage, about feeling like an outsider in a world that had no room for people like him. By his late teens, Kurt had dropped out of high school. He was living in friends' basements, sometimes sleeping under a bridge near the Wishkah River. He'd wrap himself in blankets and cardboard, listening to the water below, writing lyrics in worn notebooks. He worked dead-end jobs when he could find them. A janitor at his old high school, a maintenance worker, jobs that paid just enough to keep him barely surviving. But mostly, he was broke, hungry, desperate. He'd go days without eating properly, spending what little money he had on guitar strings instead of food. The isolation was crushing, but it was also fuel. Every rejection, every cold night, every moment of hunger, it all went into the music. He kept writing, he kept playing, he poured every ounce of his soul into his music. He didn't want fame, he didn't want money, he just wanted to be heard, to prove that his existence mattered, that his pain meant something. In 1987, Kurt formed Nirvana with bassist Chris Novoselic. They played small clubs in Seattle, blending punk aggression with melodic hooks. Their sound was raw, urgent, real. And slowly, people started to pay attention. In 1989, they released their first album, Bleach, on an independent label. It cost only $600 to record. The album was heavy, distorted, primal. It didn't sell many copies, but it got the right kind of attention. Major labels started circling. In 1991, everything exploded. Nirvana released Nevermind. The lead single, Smells Like Teen Spirit, became an anthem. The video played constantly on MTV. Within weeks, the album was outselling Michael Jackson. Overnight, Kurt Cobain went from an unknown musician sleeping on couches to the face of a generation. The transformation was violent and sudden. One week, they were playing to 300 people in a Seattle club. The next month, they were performing on Saturday Night Live. The success felt surreal. Kurt would walk into a store and see his own face on magazine covers. Teenagers wore Nirvana t-shirts who'd never heard of punk rock a year before. The band went from driving themselves in a van to flying first class. From eating fast food to being offered private chefs. Grunge became mainstream. Seattle became the center of the music universe. And Kurt became an icon, whether he wanted it or not. Magazine covers, television appearances, sold-out arenas. The world demanded more. But Kurt hated it. The fame, the interviews, the invasion of privacy. Photographers camped outside his house. Reporters dug through his trash. Strangers recognized him everywhere he went. He couldn't go to a grocery store without being mobbed. He couldn't have a private moment without it ending up in a tabloid. He never wanted to be a spokesman for anything. He just wanted to make music. But the world didn't care what he wanted. They called him the voice of Generation X. They analyzed his lyrics for hidden meanings. They asked him to explain what it all meant, as if he had answers. The pressure was suffocating. Still, there were moments of light. In 1992, he married Courtney Love, the lead singer of Hole. That same year, their daughter, Frances Bean, was born. Kurt cried when he held her for the first time. He said she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. For a brief moment, it seemed like maybe he had found something worth living for. But behind the cameras, the cracks were deepening. Kurt had always struggled with chronic stomach pain. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. The pain was constant, unbearable. And to numb it, he turned to drugs. First prescription pills, then heroin. He told himself it was just to stop the pain, but addiction doesn't care about reasons. It takes everything. His health deteriorated. His skin turned pale. His eyes grew hollow. He lost weight. He looked haunted. His marriage became volatile. They fought constantly. Both struggled with addiction. Both struggled with fame. Both struggled with demons they couldn't name. Rumors swirled in the press. Tabloids published stories about their drug use. Child Protective Services got involved, questioning whether they were fit parents. The media circus was relentless. Kurt felt hunted, exposed, like his private pain had become public entertainment. The more famous he became, the more he wanted to disappear. He wrote in his journals about feeling like a fraud, about hating himself for becoming exactly what he swore he'd never be, a product, a sellable image. He felt like he'd betrayed everything punk rock stood for. His bandmates noticed the change. He was distant, paranoid. Some days, he wouldn't show up to rehearsals. Other days, he'd play with a fury that felt almost desperate, like he was trying to scream something the world refused to hear. And through it all, he kept writing. Songs, journal entries, letters he never sent. Words were the only place he felt honest, the only place he didn't have to pretend. March 1994, Rome, Italy. Nirvana was on tour, but Kurt wasn't okay. Everyone could see it. On March 4th, Courtney found him unconscious in their hotel room. He had overdosed on champagne and Rohypnol. She called for help. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital. The official story was that it was an accident, but those close to him wondered if it was something more. He survived, barely. After 20 hours in a coma, he woke up. But something in his eyes had changed. The light was gone. They returned to Seattle, and friends urged him to get help. On March 30th, he checked into a rehab facility in Los Angeles. But he didn't want to be there. He felt trapped. On April 1st, just 2 days after checking in, he climbed over the fence and disappeared. No one knew where he went. Courtney was frantic. She hired a private investigator. His bandmates made phone calls. His mother filed a missing persons report, but Kurt had vanished. He bought a shotgun, he withdrew cash, and he returned to the house in Seattle, the one with the greenhouse above the garage, the one where no one would think to look. For days he was alone, completely alone. And that's when he started writing the letter. The letter was never meant to be a suicide note. Not in the traditional sense. It was something else. A confession, an explanation, a desperate attempt to make sense of a life that had spiraled beyond his control. The handwriting was messy. Some words were crossed out. Others were underlined twice, as if he was trying to convince himself of what he was writing. He wrote about the pain, not just the physical pain in his stomach, but the deeper pain, the emotional agony that lived in his chest and never went away. He wrote about his daughter Frances, about how much he loved her, about how terrified he was that she would grow up and see him as a failure. He apologized to her in the letter, even though she was too young to read it. He told her he was sorry for not being stronger. He wrote about Courtney, about their complicated love, about how she understood him better than anyone, but how that understanding sometimes felt suffocating. He wrote about love and resentment and guilt, all tangled together in ways he couldn't untangle. And he wrote about the music, about how it had saved him once, but now it felt like a cage. He didn't know how to be Kurt Cobain, the icon, and Kurt, the person, at the same time. The two felt impossible to reconcile. The weight of expectations crushed him. Every album had to be better. Every performance had to be perfect. Every word was analyzed and dissected. He wrote about fame and how it had destroyed him, how he felt like a puppet dancing for an audience that would never be satisfied, how he resented the fans who claimed to understand him but only saw what they wanted to see. He wrote about the contradiction of wanting to be heard but hating being listened to, of creating art for connection but feeling more isolated than ever. A haunting black and white portrait of a young man with blonde hair and intense blue eyes, staring directly at camera with empty expression. 1990s MTV Unplugged performance aesthetic. Half of his face illuminated by soft light, other half in deep shadow creating dramatic contrast. Background shows faded vintage letter paper texture, old handwriting barely visible, aged paper grain. Acoustic guitar slightly visible in frame. Cinematic noir lighting, melancholic atmosphere, emotional depth in eyes. High contrast monochrome photography, grainy film texture, documentary style. Photorealistic, ultra-detailed tragic beauty, timeless moment frozen in time. On April 8th, 1994, an electrician named Gary Smith arrived at the house. He'd been hired to install a security system. He peered through the window of the greenhouse room, and his blood went cold. Inside, he saw a body. Kurt Cobain lay on the floor, a shotgun nearby, drug paraphernalia scattered around, and the letter. Gary immediately called the police. Within minutes, the house was surrounded. Kurt had been dead for 3 days. The coroner estimated he died on April 5th. He was 27 years old. The news spread like wildfire. MTV interrupted regular programming. Radio stations played Nirvana songs back to back. Fans gathered outside the house, leaving flowers and candles. In Seattle, a candlelight vigil was organized. Thousands showed up. Courtney Love played a recording of herself reading parts of Kurt's letter. Her voice shook as she read his words. Some people sobbed. Others stood in shocked silence. The letter was found near his body. The police read it. So did investigators. Eventually, portions were made public, but the full letter, the raw, unedited version, has never been released. The parts that were too personal, too painful, those remain private. People have debated the letter ever since. Some say it was a cry for help that went unanswered. Others say it was the final statement of a tortured artist. But maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just a man, alone in a room, trying to explain the unexplainable. Kurt Cobain was 27 years old when he died, the same age as Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison. He joined what the world would later call the 27 Club, a tragic list of artists who burned too bright and faded too fast. In the years since, his music has lived on. Nevermind is considered one of the greatest albums of all time. Songs like Come As You Are and Heart-Shaped Box still play on the radio. New generations discover Nirvana and feel the same raw emotion Kurt poured into every note. Frances Bean Cobain grew up without her father. She's spoken about the complicated legacy he left behind, about growing up with his ghost always present. But she's also spoken about the love she feels when she listens to his music. Courtney Love struggled for years after his death. She faced accusations, conspiracy theories, public scrutiny. But she also kept his memory alive, fiercely protecting his artistic legacy. And the fans, the millions of people who connected with Kurt's music, they mourned, they grieved, they created memorials and tribute bands. They asked themselves if they could have done something to save him. Kurt Cobain once said, "I'd rather be hated for who I am than loved for who I'm not." He spent his entire life trying to be honest, trying to be real, and in the end, that honesty consumed him. The letter he never sent wasn't just words on a page. It was a window into a soul that was too sensitive for the world it was born into. A soul that felt everything too deeply, loved too hard, hurt too much. We'll never know what he would have written if he'd finished that letter. We'll never know what he wanted to say in those final lines. But maybe that's the point. Some stories don't have endings. Some truths don't have answers. Kurt Cobain left us too soon, but his voice, his pain, his music, they remain. Still raw, still honest, still reaching out to anyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not the fame, not the tragedy, but the reminder that it's okay to feel. It's okay to hurt, and it's okay to reach out, even when you're not sure anyone is listening. Because somewhere, in a bedroom anywhere in the world, there's a kid who feels invisible, who feels like they don't belong, and they put on Nevermind, and for a few minutes, they don't feel alone anymore. They hear someone who understood, someone who felt it too. That kid picks up a guitar or a pen, and they create something. They express what they can't say out loud. And in that moment, Kurt's legacy lives on. Not as an icon, not as a tragedy, but as a reminder that our pain can be transformed into art. Rest in peace, Kurt. The letter may have gone unfinished, but your message came through, loud and clear. The world heard you, even when you thought no one was listening. And that unfinished letter? Maybe it was never meant to be completed. Maybe the empty space at the end is where we're supposed to write our own responses, our own struggles, our own truths. The letter remains unfinished, but the conversation continues. And as long as someone somewhere is listening to his music and feeling understood, Kurt Cobain's voice echoes on. The pen stopped moving, but the story never ended. It transformed into something larger than one person could contain, into something that belongs to everyone who ever needed it. Thank you, Kurt, for the music, for the honesty, for showing us that sometimes the most beautiful art comes from the deepest pain. The letter was never sent, but the message arrived anyway.